And now it's time to bring the model into Blender and extract some modular pieces and generally clean it up a little bit. So I'm gonna go File, Import, Import FBX. That was the format that we have chosen for the export. I'm heading into the Proxy folder and importing the mesh. And here it is. It shouldn't be beautiful or clean, it's a proxy mesh after all. We can check the number of polygons by visiting this menu. Hit Statistics in there. The mesh is roughly 2 million triangles, like it should. Nothing to worry about. Let's disable the statistics for the time being. It's important to not rotate the model directly like this, even if the ground plane was set incorrectly in Reality Capture and you want to change the orientation in Blender to fix it. It's better to create an empty object, parent everything to it, and move the empty instead. So Shift A, empty, I'm adding the plane axis there. Then I'm selecting the house, shift click on the empty, right mouse button, parent, parent to object. So after doing it, we can grab the empty and rotate it instead. And so when we are done, we can reset the rotation of the empty by pressing Alt-R, and it will reset the orientation of the model. So we can export it back to Reality Capture and everything will line up just perfectly. That being said, when you export the model from Reality Capture, it adds some kind of a special file that serves the same purpose, to make things align on re-import. But this file can get lost really easily and it's better to control everything yourself, I think. I'm gonna measure the model just for fun to see if our scaling efforts paid off. So the door is roughly 1 meter wide, like it should. And the height of the building is roughly 4 meters. Probably should be less, right? But at least we're in a similar ballpark. Alright, so we have imported the mesh. Let's preview the material. As you remember, this mesh has both vertex colors and the texture. The vertex colors can be previewed from this menu, the viewport settings. I will also disable the specular lighting because it throws me off. It looks weird if you ask me with these viewport settings. As for the texture, right now we're in the Eevee rendering and we can simply switch over to the material preview mode, or to the rendered mode for that matter. In any of these modes, the diffuse texture should show up. In the material preview, we can tinker around with the HDRI lighting, for example by rotating the panorama around. Anything you want if it makes the viewport somehow more informative or aesthetically pleasing for you, if it makes you happier as a person. Now let's have a look at the shaders really quickly. The diffuse texture should be hooked up automatically on import, and we have some kind of a normal map node. We can delete it because there is no normal map in this case. If the texture looks a little bit washed out, that's due to the specular component being set to 1. We can drive it back to 0. And if you want to make it look like in Reality Capture, plug the color into the emission slot instead and set the base color to black. But I'm fine, I think, with the color being plugged into the base color socket. This way, at least, the model will still be able to interact with the light sources. It can be a benefit. So that is our basic setup for previewing the Proxy photoscanned model. Nothing too complicated, really. What to do with our Proxy building, though? Let's see. An important part of creating usable assets from a photoscan data is actually cleaning up the geometry, in our case in Blender. Let's have a look at some of the tools that may help to remove the unwanted geometry and generally mesh doctor the whole thing. I will switch over to the solid shading mode because it's the fastest one at our disposal. Let's say we would like to detach this pipe from the rest of the mesh. What we can do instead of selecting it in the edit mode, which can be a little bit sluggish, especially when it comes to really high poly geometry, is to use sculpting. So in the sculpt mode, I pressed T to invoke the left panel with the sculpting brushes, and let's search for the box mask. We can select different types of masking from there, for example, the lasso mask, and alternatively we have the mask brush. We can press right click and add these tools to our favorites menu, which can be brought up by pressing the Q shortcut by default. So I'm selecting very carefully this part of the pipe. We can add to the selection like this without holding any key. So I will extend the selection to this part of the pipe as well, and then zoom in and try to nail the selection. Okay, it looks like the pipe has been selected already. By holding Control and dragging the lasso, we can exclude the parts from the selection. And for the detail selection work, I will select the mask brush, which is also in my Q menu, the quick favorites. It's a matter of carefully brushing out the parts of the geometry that you would like to see removed. The strength should be set to 1 because gradations and fall-offs make practically no sense when it comes to masking and deleting the parts of the geometry, because the polygon will be either deleted or not. It can't be deleted partially or something like that. Within the masking menu, I'm selecting the mask slice to new object option, and that will separate the pipe from the rest of the object. It will duplicate it to a separate object pretty much. And I believe that it has also closed the hole. We didn't ask for that, but thank you so much, Blender. It can be beneficial or not, depending on what you want, though. Alright, I will put this object into its own collection in a sort of a trash bin that I called TMP, which means temporary. And I will disable the visibility for this collection. Now we can go ahead and do the same thing for the bush. First enter the sculpting mode, then T to open the left tool shelf with the brushes, select the lasso mask brush, slowly and carefully select the redundant geometry marked for deletion like this. Feel free to navigate around this thing to find a useful perspective from which it is easier to select this thing. And I think we missed this little bit. Let's add it. And then go mask. This time let's go mask slice to simply delete this object. And then, my friends, it's a matter of navigating around the mesh and spending some time in cleaning it up by first masking the parts out and then slicing them out. Nothing too fancy, it just potentially takes some time, but I guess that's inevitable. Fortunately, the sculpting tools of Blender work sufficiently fast to allow this workflow to happen, because selecting such stuff in the edit mode, as we have already said, is pretty sluggish, pretty slow overall. And as you remember, this mesh is even not so high poly, that this is a proxy mesh. Alright, let's see one more method of removing redundant geometry that doesn't require selecting stuff by hand. First, I created a cube, basically a cubic cutout Boolean object, and enabled the toggle X-ray button to see through it. I'm trying to encapsulate the geometry that I want to be deleted inside this cube. And for that reason, I'm selecting this face and extending it to make sure that the ground also intersects with the cube. And then I'm gonna add the Boolean modifier from within the modifiers tab. I'm gonna choose the fast version of the solver, make sure that the mode is set to difference, then pick the cube as our Boolean object. In order to see what's going on behind the cube, behind the scenes, let's set the display mode to bounds. And now we can see that thanks to the Boolean modifier, the polygons that were intersecting with the cube were erased from existence. We can temporarily disable the Boolean modifier in order to make some changes to the Boolean object, like for example extending some part of it, and then re-enabling the Boolean modifier back. And after we are satisfied with the result, the Boolean modifier can be collapsed or applied. So click on the triangle and apply. So that's one more reasonable way of removing the unwanted parts of the geometry without going into the edit mode, and lasso selecting individual vertices, which definitely can be pretty taxing on your computer.